All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar. We're so glad that you could be joining us today. My name is Stephanie and I will be one of your co-hosts for today's webinar. Now, today's webinar is a part of our BrainHQ Academy series where we talk about the neuroscience behind different topics. Today's topic is how the brain changes as we age and what you can do about it. So let's take a look at the agenda for today. So shortly after we wrap up with the agenda, we're going to kick off with an activity that we are calling Pixel Pursuit. More on that when we get there. Following that activity, we are going to go ahead and kick it over to Dr. Henry Mahncke. So Dr. Henry Mahncke is our CEO here at Posit Science. He earned his PhD in neuroscience at the University of California, San Francisco, where he studied brain plasticity with our co-founder, Dr. Michael Merzenich. Now, special treat today, our guest for the discussion portion of the webinar is going to be none other than Dr. Michael Merzenich. So like I said, Dr. Merzenich is the co-founder of Posit Science, our chief scientific officer, and the original brain behind BrainHQ. For nearly 5 decades, he's been a leading pioneer in brain plasticity research and has published more than 150 articles in leading peer-reviewed journals. So Henry, Mike, so glad that you could be joining us today.
Nice to see you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Yeah. Following that, we are going to move to a live Q&A. So if at any point during the presentation today you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel and a new window should pop up. You can type in your questions there, and then we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can. Now, we're not going to have an opportunity to answer every question today, but I will do my best to sort of curate questions and group similar questions together so that way we get most of them, as many as we can, answered. Now, the last thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you'd like to be notified when that video goes live, you can go to youtube.com/brainhq and subscribe there in order to receive a notification when that video goes live. All right, so let's go ahead and kick off with an activity that we are calling Pixel Pursuit. So get ready to test your brain and pop culture knowledge with Pixel Pursuit, which is an activity that is inspired by a mini game called Needs More Pixels from the web series Actually. So here's how this game is going to work. You are going to be presented with an image from a famous movie or TV show that has been pixelated beyond recognition. So I'll bring up an example here. Looks like a bunch of polygons, can't quite tell what it is, right? So after a couple of seconds, we will remove one layer of pixelation so the picture becomes a little bit more clear, like so. And then we will continue to do this until the picture becomes perfectly clear again. So we can see in this example that pixelated still was from the movie Titanic. So your goal is to identify the image before the pixelation is completely removed. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is enable chat for everybody. So that way, when you have an idea of what the answer to the question is, you can go ahead and type it in chat, and then we can follow along with your answers and call out people if you get it right. All right, so let's go to our first level here. So this is our first image in Pixel Pursuit.
Well, I hope some people are thinking about what's in the chat because I couldn't tell you at first. But what I will tell everyone who's watching and listening that the reason we're doing this game is it turns out that this idea is pretty related to the neuroscience of brain aging and what happens to the brain as we age and why it leads to the consequences it does. So we'll play the game first, then we're going to talk about the science. I got nothing so far, though.
Still nothing? Mike, what do you think? Does that image look at all remotely familiar? Nope.
Not to me, not to me.
It looks like a large flower to me. So I'm gonna need a little bit more detail, but let's see if we have some guesses coming in. Someone thinks it might be tennis. I like that idea.
Karen had guessed Pulp Fiction. Good guess. We have Sound of Music, La La Land. Okay.
Ooh,
looks
dancers.
like
A lot of thinking about singing and dancing. Let's see how
that. Interesting. All right, let's go ahead and make it a little bit more clear now.
Okay, wait. I see someone said woman in a red dress, and I feel like that might be on target here.
Yeah.
Either that or some kind of a fox or a dog on the top of a head.
Oh, I like that too. Beauty and the Beast. That's a good idea.
Lisa is the first person who has gotten this answer correctly. I'll give it another couple seconds for people to type it in, but I'm very excited. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. And we have Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek.
She is reaching out her arm, so if you guessed boxing, you were not wrong in thinking that some kind of action like that was going on.
And people who said woman in red dress, you're not wrong. The Starfleet uniform at the time for their particular class was red. So
Okay.
yeah. Let's go and do another round here. This one,
Okay.
it's very, yeah.
Dog on a snowy background. How about that? Just so everyone knows, I haven't seen any of these yet, so I'm operating from the same level you are.
All right, let's go ahead and go another level clearer.
Oh.
Not much better.
No, so this is basically an image, and the way we might think about it is that Stephanie's added a lot of noise to the image. We're probably all familiar with listening to something in a noisy environment, and we know that, hey, if the environment's very noisy, it's harder to hear what someone is saying, it's harder to pay attention, it's harder to remember it. But the same thing's true in vision. This is a kind of visual noise, and by adding this visual noise, Stephanie's made this image harder to see and harder to figure out. So.
All right, we've got a couple more guesses, but I'm not seeing the correct answer yet. So let's go ahead and make that a little bit more clear.
White and 101 Dalmatians. Okay. Oh, this one's coming together a bit better now for me. Okay.
Yep, everybody's coming in with it now.
Wild.
Yep.
All right.
So,
I think we have a lot of good guesses here. Yes.
Yeah, as most of you guessed with that last iteration, this is a still from E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
Okay. I like the person who guessed Snow White, though, because there is that red or Little Red Riding Hood I think I saw go by, because that hoodie and is very emblematic of that fairy tale as well.
Yeah. With all the people guessing something about a snowstorm, I'm curious to see what the answer is going to be for this next image that's coming up.
Go with a snowstorm.
There is I'll give you a hint. There is snow in a related movie to this movie.
Oh, okay. All right.
Which sounds like a nothing hint, but once you know the movie, you'll be like, oh yes, of course.
All right. Well, again, it's almost like
Mary
environment.
And Carmel have already nailed it, and Lisa coming in again, nailing it. So I won't reveal it just yet because I want more people to keep guessing. Yep. Lots of people are getting this one now. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go one more.
I must admit, I like the Snow White guess also. That seems like
the Snow White guess is good.
A lot to be said for
that. Yep, everybody I think is getting this one. So it is Princess Leia from Alderaan in Star Wars.
Okay.
So not a snowstorm, but they do go to Hoth in the next movie.
Okay. Well, Stephanie, we saw, I think, what did we see? We saw Star Trek, we saw E.T., and we saw Star Wars. Is there anything you'd like to share with us about the kind of movies that you enjoy in your free time?
I did kind of put together a lot of science fiction, a lot of space-related movies for this one. Yeah.
All right. Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah, so that is going to wrap it up for Pixel Pursuit. Thank you all for participating. I hope you guys had as much fun playing that as I did hosting it and throwing that together. That was a lot of fun. But Henry is going to go ahead and take over now and share the presentation portion of it with you.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about how the brain changes as we age, and equally importantly, what you can do about it. And it's really interesting. The reason that Stephanie and I picked this activity, she picked the images, but we picked the activity together, is because as we talked about briefly, that activity really shows you how important noise in your environment is. And like we said, we've all been in a noisy restaurant. We have a hard time hearing or paying attention or remembering. In the visual world, it's true as well. If you have that kind of noise in your visual environment, the way Stephanie showed by pixelating those images, it can make it very hard to see, to perceive, to remember, to understand, even to think about kind of what you're seeing. And we did that because a lot of what we're going to talk about today when we talk about the aging brain and around what happens to it is how does a brain become noisy? How does that affect our perception and our cognition? And then, hey, what can we do to fix it? But to talk about how brains change when we age, we're actually first going to start and talk about, well, how do brains change at all? Because if we understand how they change in the first place, we'll understand a lot better about how they change as they age. And so we're going to start actually with the brain of a baby. This is actually my son, Jasper, when he was just born. This is the day he was born. And babies are incredible. They are lovely. We fall in love with them. We take care of them. But if you step back a little bit, the brain of a baby can't do very much, right? When a baby's born, a baby can cry and they can eat, but that's about it, right? They really can't crawl. They really can't control their limbs. They certainly can't talk or do much of anything else terribly useful. And that's because when that baby is born, the brain is not very well organized yet to do all of those things. But that brain organization starts to kick in very quickly. And by that time, the baby grows up into a toddler. And here's my son, Jasper, as he's first starting to toddle around the world. All kinds of interesting things have happened in that brain. First of all, the brain can now control that toddler's actions, right? They've learned how to walk and to balance, at least mostly. And that's a pretty complex task that a brain has learned how to do. And also, often toddlers have started to develop kind of unique and interesting skills. So in this case, my son Jasper was given a drum by just an absolutely wonderful aunt who loved him and us to death, no doubt. And he started to learn how to play that drum, and it occupied all of his attention. And it was so rewarding to him to, to be able to control his little arms and hit that drum with a stick and make a loud noise and make everyone in the room jump. And, what we knew then, of course, is his brain was beginning to wire itself and beginning to develop these complex real world skills that, of course, he hadn't had when he was a baby. And hey, and if a person keeps at it, and my son did, you can develop an incredibly specialized brain with unique and powerful skills. My son's 23 years old right now. He is actually a rock star. He's a drummer at a rock band, and they're on tour as we speak. And his brain has become unique and differentiated from the brains of just about everyone else on the planet in terms of these unique skills that he has. And that's come through the process of brain change, brain rewiring, and we call it brain plasticity as scientists. Now, it turns out that happens to just about everyone. It happens to every kid as they grow up. Every single person on this webinar has built a unique brain as a result of their entire lifetime of experiences. Everything they've experienced, everything they've learned, everything they've done, everything that's happened to them has rewired and reshaped their brain to make it unique. Here's a woman, for example, who grew up and built an incredible brain capable of doing these amazing soccer skills that I can't do. And Stephanie, I don't think you can do, and Mike can do, but her brain is wired to do that because of all the experience and training she's had. Here's a guy whose brain is so fast that he can drive a Formula One car at 200 miles an hour and do it successfully and win races, right? Here's someone who has wired up their brain through training and experience in such a way that they can take what they see and they can transform it into a painted image in front of them. And in fact, every skill that you can think of, woodworking and weaving and industrial skills, all of this is a result of rewiring and building a brain as a result of experience and learning and change. So that is how a brain gets built. But now let's look at the neuroscience of it so we can understand, well, wait, what's really happening in the brain during this process? And here we're going to tell this story in reverse, right? We're first going to look at the brain of an adult. And in this case, we're going to look at an adult rat because that's the kind of thing that we can study as neuroscientists. And this data actually came out of Mike's lab from once upon a time. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the surface of the brain of an adult rat, and we're looking at the part of the brain that relates to hearing. And, you might think, and you'd be right, well, different parts of the brain do different things. And it turns out there's a part that's very specific to hearing. But what's interesting about all those parts of the brain is they're organized in what we might call a map. And what that means is the brain actually represents what's going on in the world in an organized way. And in the auditory parts of the brain, the hearing parts of the brain, they're actually laid out kind of like a piano. And so if we look down on this auditory part of the brain, this color coding shows us, well, what frequency of a note does this part of the brain respond to? And the low notes are shown here in blue, and the middle notes are kind of shown in green and orange, and the high notes are shown in orange and red. And so that part of the brain in a rat and in a person too is laid out exactly like the keys on the piano. There's a well-organized map of the world, in this case, the frequencies that you can hear right there in your brain. So where does that come from? Well, if we rewind the clock a little bit and we look at a rat who's just 3 weeks old, which is, young for a rat, not a baby, but young, we see that, well, that map has started to develop, but it's kind of disorganized compared to an adult brain. First of all, there's just more of it, right? More of the brain is processing these sounds, and you can see kind of the initial organization of it from low to high, but it's not as organized and detailed as it is as an adult. And in fact, if you look at a rat that's only 2 weeks old, so sort of a newborn rat, you see that, well, it just starts off as a complete mess, right? There's large regions that aren't responsive to any sound at all. And, just kind of responding to a few sounds in the middle. And there's parts that don't respond at all. And this isolated bit over here, who knows what that's doing, doesn't seem to be connected to the rest of the auditory parts of the brain yet. And when you look at this now going forward from a young brain to an adult brain, you see that there's this process by which this map of the world becomes accurate. It starts off kind of messy, gets more accurate, and it gets even more accurate. And in fact, what the science has shown us is this happens because, well, the rat experiences sound and interacts with the world of sound. And that interaction with the world and hearing those sounds and doing the things a rat needs to do with sound actually causes this wonderful, accurate map to be built. And that process, again, we call it brain plasticity, the brain rewiring itself in response to experience and learning, is how we build an accurate and useful brain. And you might think, well, maybe this just happens with genetics, right? That's how a lot of our body is built. But it turns out that's not the case. If you look at a human brain, there's actually more connections between neurons in the brain than there are genes in your entire genetic system. And that means the genetic system can't tell the brain precisely ahead of time how it should be wired up. The brain needs to have that experience and learning with the world to get wired up. So, we see that as a kind of a positive spiral that happens. It starts off with the brain engaging with interesting, complex sensory stimuli. And as a result of that engagement, the brain builds those fast, accurate maps of the world, like we saw in the upper left on the last slide. And those fast, accurate maps, got high signal and low noise. And we showed that very simple map, which just looked like the keys on a piano, but just about everything that you perceive and think about and do is actually controlled by some kind of map in your brain, whether it's hearing sound or seeing the world or playing the drums or using a computer. Some part of your brain's got that fast, accurate system to let you do that. Well, once you have that fast, accurate brain map, well, also what happens is the parts of your brain that deal with attention and reward, these are systems that actually control learning, because in order to learn, you have to pay attention and you have to be rewarded by what you learn. Those systems in the brain themselves are strengthened. And as a result of that, well, you get better cognitive function. You can perceive the world more easily. You can think about it more easily. You can remember it more easily. That lets you do more challenging tasks. And then we're back to this beginning of the cycle again. That lets you engage in the world more. So the brain builds itself up through this kind of positive upward spiral. And that change, as we talked about, is brain plasticity. That happens in kids. It happens with adults. It happens when your brain is healthy. It happens when your brain is not so healthy. It's just pretty much how the brain works. So knowing that, thinking about how the brain builds those fast, accurate maps and how those end up being useful for everything we think about and see and hear and do, let's talk about the opposite side of this. Let's talk about the aging process. So what happens as we get older? Well, this is a pretty common picture about getting older, although I'm going to tell you a few details about it in a minute. But the most common picture of getting older is, well, hey, on the average, that sharp brain can decline. This is a study that was done with hundreds and hundreds of people of all kinds of ages, shown here on the bottom, from ages 20 to 90. And in this case, a scientist at the University of Virginia looked at a bunch of different measures of their cognitive performance, things like their speed and their memory and their visual skills and their thinking skills, even their vocabulary. And what he found out is, well, on the average, most of these skills kind of decline over time. And in fact, studies have shown us that peak cognitive performance really happens when you're maybe 28 or 29. And then after that, on the average, again, we'll come back to that in a minute, that decline begins. And when we're middle-aged, we might say we're distractible. And as we get older, we might say we have senior moments. And as we get very older on the average, we might say, hey, that's cognitive decline. The only thing that really stays steady actually is your vocabulary. You do learn more over the years. And so that then raises a question, right? Is this happening because the brain just wears out over time? We saw that beautiful maps that were built. Do those just wear out over time, like an old computer or an old pair of shoes? Does this happen to everyone? Is it inevitable? Well, The way a lot of people think about it now, and certainly the way we think about it at Posit Science and BrainHQ, is that this isn't just a matter of the brain wearing out. We think about this cognitive change and these cognitive decline that happens as an active process. You might think of it as a negative form of brain plasticity. In the same way that positive cycle of learning and brain change builds up a brain, you can actually run that process in reverse. And what seems like happens is that, as we get older, we actually lose some input from our senses. Many people probably know that you lose certain high frequency hearing as you get older. It's hard to hear those higher notes. And that's because the hair cells in your ear that vibrate with sound just start to, wear off. They're just out there in your ear, and they just break off over time. And that means you get worse input from your ears into your brains. You lose fast, accurate input. Well, as a result of that, perhaps you start to disengage from interesting, challenging activities. It's hard to hear as well. Maybe you don't go out with your friends as much because it's hard to hear what they're saying. Or maybe you used to go out and hear music and you don't enjoy doing that as much anymore. And as a person disengages from those kinds of activities, those brain maps that I showed you, they become slower and less accurate and even noisier in a way, right? We're running this process in reverse. And as those brain maps become slower and less accurate and noisier, you sort of weaken those systems of attention and reward that control learning. Your brain is less able to change itself in a positive direction. And as a result, a person might have a less ability or even interest in engaging in challenging tasks, right? It's just harder to get out there and harder to tackle those challenging things that the brain is used to doing. And then, of course, we just accelerate that negative spiral. Well, we have less engagement with the world. We don't want to do all the things we used to do. And then our brain can perhaps just keep spiraling downwards like that. So the key thing is that we think about it as an active process that runs that way. It's not just that your brain is wearing out like a computer or an old shoe. It's that these changes are actively happening and they're, wiring the brain back down again. So that leads to what we think of as noisy information processing, right? We look back at that brain and we see that it's not fast and accurate anymore. It's not processing information well. Just like Stephanie showed us at the beginning of this talk, instead of seeing that beautiful, clear picture of Star Wars, we're seeing that kind of noisy, messy picture of Star Wars because our brain is slowed down and become less accurate and become more noisy. And that directly affects brain health, as it turns out. So again, wonderful work done from Mike's lab. We're looking at two rats here. This rat's a younger rat, and this rat is an older rat. And if you look right in the brain and you ask the brain, you play a sound for it, shown in this little red line here and here, and then you just listen to what the brain response is like. Well, when the brain is young, and that young rat, every time we play that sound, that click, for example, we can see brain activity happens. These little black marks represent the response of the brain. And there's not much going on before we play the sound, and then we play the sound. Every time we play it, we get a beautiful, strong response. But in that older brain, like we said, it's become noisier, right? Before we even play the sound, there's a lot of activity in the brain. And then the response to the sound is kind of noisy and variable. That ends up being true when we look at the direct measures of noise. Here, we're looking at those brain maps again. Now, the color represents the noise in the brain, where blue is a more fast, accurate response, and red is kind of noisier and messier. And we see that in young rats, a lot of fast, accurate responses, and in older rats, we see that noise. And that's true even at the level of brain health. Here, what we're looking at is micrograph images of the brain. And in the young rat, you see a lot of these red dots. These are a particular kind of neuron in the brain that actually helps control how the brain is synchronized together. And then as those rats get older, you see fewer of those neurons and they have less activity. So all of these things are related. As we are getting older, on the average, we'll come back to that brain gets noisier. We see it in all these measures. And in fact, when Mike and his colleagues looked at this, they saw that virtually every aspect of brain structure and function changed with aging. Myelination, which is the insulation around the neurons, just how much volume of the brain there was, the number of connections. You might have heard of plaques and tangles as related to Alzheimer's disease. Well, they start to emerge. Lewy bodies related to Lewy body dementia starts to emerge. Even the barrier that keeps the blood separate from the brain starts to get a little bit leakier. And these are all related and kind of happening at the same time. And that directly affects cognitive function, right? If we think about hearing, what we're looking at here is called a spectrogram. It's an image of a sound. And what we're looking at here is the sound that starts here, if I say the word time. And here we're looking at the image of the sound when I say the word kind. And, you can see that these are really pretty similar. If you just look at them, you might say, well, how would anyone ever be able to tell the difference? But there is a little bit of a difference here, up here, as that T sound starts, there's kind of this downward swoop in the sound energy. Whereas when the K starts in kind, there's kind of an upward swoop. And your brain has to have fast, accurate processing to hear that difference. Now, you might imagine if Stephanie took these images and kind of pixelated them, you wouldn't be able to see the difference. And if you have a noisy brain, you wouldn't be able to hear the difference either. And if you can't hear the difference very well, you're not going to hear it well, but you might also start to notice that you have memory problems, right? People might say words to you and you have a hard time paying attention or even remembering them in a bit. And the same thing is true in the visual system as well. Stephanie gave a wonderful example of that, but another great example comes from driving. If you have a sharp, accurate brain, you're going to be able to see everything that's in front of you because all that information is going to make it through the little tiny bit of noise in your brain. But if you add a lot of brain noise to what you see, well, you're probably only going to be able to see directly what's in front of you. And in fact, you're not going to notice things so much in your peripheral vision. And this is going to show up as attention problems. I remember back when my dad was driving, he used to say, well, a car just came in out of nowhere. I'm like, well, it didn't exactly come out of nowhere, right? My dad had kind of noisy processing in his visual system. And so he just didn't notice things that showed up. And of course, that showed up as an attention problem. So what can we do about that, right? If we understand that what's happening is that brain aging is an active process, that we're rewiring the brain a little bit by accident to make it more noisy in this way and not be faster and accurate, why do we think we could do something about it? Well, the answer is that if we look at aging, it's actually a much more variable process, right? We showed a graph that looked like this, right? As people get older on the average, cognitive function declines. But if you look at individual people, there's a huge amount of variability, right? Here's some people who are in their 20s who are below the average. Here's some people in their 90s who are frankly as good as people in their 20s. Everyone's different, right? Maybe this person is so low here at their 20 because they suffered a traumatic brain injury, a head injury, Maybe this person who's even below average at 60, maybe they lived in a poor neighborhood near a chemical dump and that had some effects on their brain health. How about this guy? Here he is, 78 years old, right? Cognitive function better than most people in their 20s. I actually met this guy once. It turns out he was a Morse code operator during World War II. And as a result, he had one of the most fast, accurate brains of anyone I've ever met and absolutely great cognitive function as he was aging. So if everyone is different like that, that gives us some hope. Can we take a brain that's on the lower end of this distribution and through that upward spiral that we talked about, can we drive it into the higher side? Can we reverse brain aging? Not so much in terms of making you younger, but if a brain is down here, can we use that process to push it up to here? And it turns out we absolutely can do that, right? If we want to improve brain health and cognitive function, we got to train the brain. If we want the brain to have fast, accurate brain maps, as we talked about before, that have a high signal and no noise. If we want the brain to have strong attention and reward systems to control learning, well, we need to build brain training exercise that require the brain to be fast and accurate. We need to build those brain training exercises to be adaptively challenging, to really push a person's brain forward at each step with learning. And of course, we need to heavily engage those attention and reward systems throughout the process. Now, it turns out if you do that with rats, and here's a rat who's been through a rat brain training program that was developed in Dr. Merzenich's lab back in the day, and you can see that she's graduated from the program because there's her little mortarboard there. Well, you can take that brain and you can give it exact performance of a younger brain again. When you look at the responses to noise, we see that there's not much background noise here and the brain responds fast and accurately. If you just look at, well, how noisy is the brain? You see all this beautiful blue again, showing that the brain is fast and precise and accurate as opposed to noisy the way it was before. And then even if you look at these basic measures of brain health, like how many of these cells there are that control brain activity, we see that those cells have to some extent been renormalized in their activity, all by giving the brain the right input that it craves, making it faster and accurate and adaptively challenging it and engaging those attention and reward systems. So what that tells us is that because brain aging is an active process, it's not just wear and tear where it's worn out. The brain has actively unbuilt itself over time. By asking it to do the right things like this, we can cause the brain to actively build itself back up again. So what are those right things? Well, that's probably the key thing that everyone wants to think about. So let's talk about a few, and I'm sure we'll talk about some more during the Q&A. We're looking for activities that, again, require speed and accuracy and that are progressively challenging and that engage attention and reward. And often in my line of work, a lot of people ask me about crossword puzzles, right? Are crossword puzzles good for brain health? It really feels like my brain is busy when I'm doing that crossword puzzle, right? I'm thinking really hard. But it doesn't really actually require my brain to be fast or accurate. Most crossword puzzles are not progressively challenging. However hard it is how hard it is, and you're either going to get it or you're not. And it certainly engages your attention, but doesn't really give you reward on a constant basis, right? Maybe you feel good if you get it right in the end, or you feel bad if you don't. And for that reason, we don't really think about things like crossword puzzles as terribly helpful for brain health. And in fact, in a lot of the studies that we do here with BrainHQ, we use crossword puzzles as a control or a placebo activity. But what are activities that can make a brain get faster and more accurate and that are challenging and engage attention and reward this way? Well, here are a few examples, right? Maybe you have the opportunity to learn to play a racket sport, whether it's, something as simple as ping pong or as complicated as tennis or even pickleball, of course, very popular these days. To see that ball coming, to control your hand, to hit it back, all that requires your brain to be fast and accurate. It can be progressively challenging because you're going to maybe start with people who aren't so good if you're learning the sport like me and then get better over time. And it certainly engages your attention and your reward systems. Or maybe think about a musical instrument. Again, something simple like a recorder or a harmonica. Maybe you have a guitar that's been lying around for a long time, or maybe like my son, you're going to learn to play the bongos. When you listen to music and then when you have to play it, again, that requires your brain to be fast and accurate, to rebuild those kinds of maps in your brain that we talked about. And again, progressively challenging because you're going to learn it step by step and certainly engaging attention and reward systems. Learning a foreign language is a good example as well. A lot of people don't like to do it because they feel like, well, this isn't going to be helpful unless I become fluent, and I'm never going to become fluent in German, so why should I even try? But actually, just the learning process of hearing different speech than you're used to hearing, and again, training your brain to listen to those fast, accurate distinctions, adaptively getting better at it, that's actually still good for the brain. And of course, BrainHQ training, right? Everything that you've heard today might have reminded you of certain BrainHQ exercises. Those little sweeps that we saw when the person was saying time or kind, well, that's exactly why we built the auditory sweeps exercise in BrainHQ. That notion of how your vision starts to shrink down when it's in a noisy environment, well, that's exactly why we built the double decision exercise in BrainHQ. Every exercise in BrainHQ requires speed and accuracy to, again, rebuild that element of information processing and brain health. And every exercise in BrainHQ is adaptively challenging and requires your attention and gives you rewards as you get it right. So all of these things, just wonderful ways to kind of run that cycle back in reverse, and rebuild, strengthen, and maintain brain health. So I'll stop there with kind of my science overview, and we are going to turn our attention to a discussion with Dr. Merzenich. Mike, are you there on the line?
I am here.
Fantastic. Well, you and your lab and your collaborators from around the world are, of course, the people that, really developed these ideas of brain plasticity. And, frankly, more than any other single person on the planet, it's your understanding of how the brain worked with brain plasticity that led us to these ideas about aging and how to fix it. But I wonder if we can rewire the clock here a little bit and ask you to look back a little bit, as you were doing all the science that you did, what were the first things that made you realize that adult brains could change? What did neuroscientists think about adult brains when you were starting in your career, and what made you think differently?
Well, the initial idea, when I was a young scientist, was people believed the brain just grew up and it developed its mature wiring when you were a kid, little kid, and you were stuck with it for life. And basically, you had to account for all of the wonderful things that brains did. And as we evolved in the creation of our personhoods and all of the things we learned to do with that hard wiring, it's sort of like the computer on your desk. You had to account for it by a fixed machine. No one understood how that could possibly occur, but that was a predominant belief. It largely came from studies in the visual system. And actually, I was studying the listening brain. And I could see as a young scientist, as I was studying the listening brain, that it was really hard to understand why it would be designed in the way it was designed. And if it wasn't plastic, if it wasn't somehow taking advantage of the different way it was designed, and I don't want to really talk about that so much. I want to say that in parallel with that, I was doing studies that led to the development of a device called the cochlear implant. The cochlear implant is a device which was designed to restore hearing in people that were totally deaf. And my laboratory was one of the laboratories in the world. There were 3 in which people developed usable cochlear implants that are now the sort of commercial cochlear implants out there in the world to this day. And when we developed these devices, we were limited in 2 ways. We could only introduce we were trying to stimulate the nerve of it in a dead ear. The nerve was still partly intact, but the hearing organ itself was destroyed. That's why they were deaf. And we're trying to stimulate the nerve with pattern stimulation that simulated the sounds that would be represented in a normally hearing person. We were limited in 2 ways. We only had access to the squeakiest part of the inner ear. You could say the only part we could stimulate that we get access to surgically was the sounds well above the range of hearing in frequency. And so, and the second limitation is that we could only really re-engage the hearing nerve by shocking it electrically. And that shocking generated relatively crude inputs from the ear to the brain. And so I analogized it to playing Chopin with your forearms. It was not really a very precise way to engage the brain, with the hope of really recovering language. We knew there was probably enough information to re-represent speech, but we thought that people would have to go through a long learning process. And in trying to make sense of this lousy input that we could generate from the squeaky part of the ear with this very crude information from the. And so we weren't surprised when we turned these devices on that people said it sounded like something really strange, like a robot talking or some really strange, very, very difficult for them to make any sense of it. We tried very hard to think about how we'd have to manipulate this sound, the stimulation, to make it more understandable for them, while their brain went to work on it. And to our shock, 3 or 4 or 5 months later, they heard everything.
Wow.
We're not talking about children. We're talking about people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who had been deaf, maybe for a significant period of time, heard nothing, and all with this very crummy new input delivered by our devices, a miracle occurred. The brain was able to interpret it and make sense of it. And now they actually said it sounded just like it sounded before they lost their hearing. Not only that, but across the world, in Austria and in Australia, the other 2 teams used very different coding strategies to translate the sound into electrically shocking the nerve. And we thought, oh, they can't possibly work. What do these people know? It turned out their devices also worked. Their patients also recovered their hearing in time, and also said that it sounded just like it sounded before they lost their hearing. The brain didn't care. It was able to adapt itself to modify the way it interpreted that input. And this is not just plasticity on a small scale. This is plasticity in an old brain on a large scale. So that immediately led us to do experiments, initiate experiments in rats. To study these processes of change, this led us relatively rapidly to studies in which we trained rats, believed to be aplastic, not able to change, to acquire new skills and abilities in listening and in the use of information from their hands. And what we saw is that as they improved in an ability, the brain changed in a way that accounted for the improvement. The brain responded more rapidly, more accurately, more precisely. As the behavior became more, performance became more accurate, more precise, more accurate.
So that must have been pretty revolutionary, right? Because I remember when I first came to neuroscience graduate school, and I was told that the brain was wired up the way it was done. I was told that brain cells died one by one, and that's what happened as we got old. I was told, hey, one reason not to drink too much in college is alcohol killed brain cells, and you were just going to wear yourself out. What was it like to start to appreciate that the brain could rewire itself that way? And what did other neuroscientists think about that?
Well, initially there was a kind of strange reaction to it. You know, the experiments were done in a way in which they were the outcomes were undeniable, but people didn't want to believe it. You know, people would rise up at scientific meetings and say, "How can this possibly be true?" You know, the sort of religion that the brain was plastic when you were a baby, but then plasticity was over, you know, at a very young age, was just so embedded in the science, also in neurology, in education in general, all across everyone that was interested in the brain and its development, they held this religion. And so overcoming this embedded sort of incorrect notion. I mean, actually, plasticity is the brain's big trick. It's one of the most fundamental things that it's doing in life. It's actually creating your personhood. It's creating you in all of the wondrous things that you can do as a function of how you engage in the world and how you acquire all of your special skills and abilities that are you.
Yeah,
The fact that it could not have been, the fact that anyone would argue with this once this began to be revealed it was sort of difficult for me to live with, but I knew that the truth would win out, and that ultimately.
And you were right. If you open any neuroscience textbook now, there's going to be at least one chapter in there about brain plasticity based on the work of you and your colleagues from all over the country and all over the world. So you won that war. And then tell me, how did you start to think about the aging brain, right? You know, you look at this aging brain, everything is going downhill, as we talked about. Every single major measure of brain health is kind of going downhill at the same time. What made you first think that you could kind of take this basic science that you had seen and help reverse these processes in an aging brain and without even doing a surgical intervention, right? With a cochlear implant, you had to put something inside the person's head. What made you first think, hey, this might be possible in an aging brain, and with a computer, not with a medical device?
Well, one thing that occurred in my own life in parallel with this, that my mother developed dementia. And it stimulated me to think about the brain of an older individual. But also we knew that the brain, we actually studied animals, and one of the things we did was specifically look at the plasticity that applied in the brain of an animal of old age, you could say. And you described this a little bit in a wonderful way in your presentation, but we saw that those brains were just as plastic as young brains. And we saw that you could drive a brain that was in an animal near the end of life, and you could make major differences so that in many respects, almost every respect, the brain could look like the brain of a relatively young animal. So that led us to believe that we should be able to drive the brain of an older human, or a human of any age, you could say, to a higher functional state. And we knew that if the brain was driven in a direction in which it increased the operational speed and its accuracy, we knew that the brain could only be fast and accurate if it was relatively advanced in how the machinery of the brain was operating. And we also knew that a fast and accurate brain would drive strong inputs into the more complex areas of processing in the brain and keep it alive and keep it functional. And so we had the intuition that we should be able to have powerful impacts on brains of humans of any age, just like we appeared to do in animals. I might say one other thing, Henry.
Yeah.
That is to say, when we trained an animal and we rejuvenated its brain, we also saw that it lived longer. And we began to appreciate that a healthy brain was an important asset for sustaining a healthy body. Basically keeping brain and body in better stead. They go together.
Yep. That's right. You know, people occasionally forget that the brain is a part of the body, maybe the most important part of the body.
They often operate medically and in practice as if the body is disconnected from the brain.
Yes, that's common enough. So maybe you could, I'll ask one more question and then maybe we'll take some questions because I see we're starting to get quite a few. You know, as you step back, you know, you led one revolution, right? Which is when I introduce you, I usually tell people you cured deafness, which is a pretty good thing to have on your resume, right? And you've led a number of revolutions in neuroscience, and most recently, the one around brain training, as we've talked about, the thinking that you've done on aging and the building out of BrainHQ. BrainHQ is used by people all over the world at this point. BrainHQ is in use by more than 32 Medicare programs available for free for people. It's changing the way that we think about aging and changing the way we think about brain health. But I know that on your mind is probably so much more we could be doing with this idea of brain plasticity. So if you could tell me and the folks who are listening, well, what's the biggest, I know there's so much we've left undone, and I know you come into work and you tell me every day all the things that are undone.
Right.
But what's the biggest thing on your mind that says, hey, if people really appreciated the power of brain plasticity, that we would be doing to think more correctly about brain health?
Henry, it should be in every life. We should have an understanding of the importance of engaging our brain in a sense of exercising it, like we think about our physical body. Now, we can see our physical body, and we have much more of an appreciation in a much more direct sense of whether we're in good shape or not, you could say. But we have a relatively weaker notion about our brain. We're getting by, we're surviving neurologically. But almost every one of us could be stronger. Everyone us could be operating more effectively. And very importantly, almost every one of us could be safer, more resilient, less likely to fall into a neurological or step on a neurological or a psychiatric landmine. And we should absolutely be managing brain health. When we go to the doctor now, yes, the doctor asks you how you're doing. You say, I'm doing okay. You just had your annual brain exam, I mean, what the heck? There's just very little attention spent to the brain in monitoring its status, its health, its operational capacities. And it should be at the forefront of how we think about we're doing and how we are managing our life, and how our medicine should be helping us with it.
Yep, that makes a perfect sense. We have that ahead of us to figure out with the medical system. So
Yeah,
I'd like to see it. I sometimes think every time I see my doctor, I get my blood pressure taken, right? You can't go into a doctor without getting your blood pressure taken. We need to get to a world where every time you see your doctor, they figure out something real quick about your brain health to help you stay on the right path. So.
And then, Henry, also just to say, I know I don't want to talk too long here and let the audience have a few questions answered, but there are so many groups of people that are struggling because of things beyond their control. Maybe it's because they've had a terrible life and they've struggled in life so much, and they've ended up in difficult circumstances in life in a whole variety of ways, in mental illness or in jail or in all kinds of other trouble. Maybe they have acquired some condition, some mental condition, some neurological condition, or some physical condition that's also compromising their life in neurological terms. Not to be more effectively bringing the powers of this science to help them. It's so frustrating to me, because if everyone was aware of the fact that this is all about changing the brain power, and anyone that's struggling in this way, to improving it in a significant way in their life, to make their life more effective, more powerful, happier, more useful, probably longer. I mean, it just, we have to get to people more broadly who are struggling in life. That's a main goal I have as a scientist in the remaining years I have on this planet.
And that's why you founded Posit Science, and that mission is still guides us and brings us into work every day. So thank you for that. Well, Stephanie, we must have some questions piling up from the audience. Mike and I could probably talk all day, but let's take some questions and see what we can tackle here.
Yeah, absolutely. Boy, do we have a lot of questions, and a lot of wonderful questions too. So I'm going to try and sort of condense them a little bit here if I can.
Okay.
So we've had a lot of people write in saying, I know somebody who has MS, mild cognitive decline, Lewy body dementia, hearing loss, stroke recovery, et cetera. Lots of people have written in either with these conditions or are in close contact with a loved one who has one of these conditions. And they have all asked, would training with BrainHQ be helpful to people with these conditions?
Mike, why don't you take a swing at that?
Well,
what unites all these different conditions? Is each one of them different, like a very different, butterfly in a collection, or is there something common about all these conditions that we might think about?
The last time I looked at the research that we had supported or we'd help people complete independently with us using BrainHQ tools, I looked at the number of clinical indications that people had tried to deal with, and I think the number I saw was 23 different clinical indications. These things like including the categories of people that you just described. And basically what was seen in all of them was that people were, in every case, a relatively limited course of training was applied. And much more could have been done on the training side. But still, in every case, I think with very few exceptions, maybe 70 or 80 trials, more than that, I'm sure. But there are probably 7 or 80 trials in mental illness alone. But maybe 100, more than 100 trials, people saw positive changes, improvements that were highly significant. So you could take a condition like MS, several beautiful control trials, very significant improvements, very significant a very, very strong indication that people were just a lot better off, a lot more effective, and probably a lot more resistant to having another relapse into another negative cycle. And so, but you can look at condition after condition after condition, and exercising your brain in general is positive. Now, one of the things, think about it this way. When you exercise your brain, you basically change everything that supports its health. You're not just improving its wiring. You're improving the way the brain is controlling blood flow, nutrient supply, and you're improving the way the brain is supporting the machinery that's protecting it against invasive species that could lead to a brain infection. You're improving the insulation on its wires. You're improving all kinds of things. Just like when you exercise your body, everything that supports your physical performance is improving. It's the same.
Mm-hmm.
So if you exercise your brain, almost no matter what your vicissitude, you will broadly improve your operations in the machinery inside your skull. And that's what BrainHQ is designed to do. It's designed to improve the brain broadly in all of its powers in a way that it supports its capacity to change and to strengthen these great operational systems of the brain that are you.
Yep.
And almost no matter what your challenge, it should provide a level of help.
Yep. From a science perspective, I, of course, agree very strongly. This is the part where, as the CEO, I do have to say, hey, BrainHQ is not a medical device. If you're looking for, help specifically with any medical condition, you should talk to your doctor. But, Mike, what's been interesting to me about this science as we've done it over the past 20 years is, you look at someone who has MS, or you look at someone who has schizophrenia, or you look at someone who has a mild traumatic brain injury, and various different things have happened to their brains, but their brain information processing, that notion of a noisy brain, that ends up being a common element in all of those conditions.
Over and over.
I have to think that the same techniques that we've shown over and over again that help take out that noise and improve processing in an older brain are going to be helpful in all those kinds of conditions as well. As you and I know, there's quite a few studies going on right now, and we're looking forward to learning more about it. So
one of the reasons for that is that when you improve the speed of operations and the accuracy of operations in the brain, you actually improve its coordinated location-specific coordination, and it drives information forward into brain systems in a much more powerful form.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way basically to re-engage brain systems much more strongly at the higher levels of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And most of these conditions, those levels are that's where the substantial impairment is arising. That's where the memory is occurring, where the cognitive deficits are arising.
Exactly.
You need to empower the brain so that machinery is back into a strong operational form again.
Stephanie, what else do we have?
Yeah, we had a couple of follow-up questions actually to your presentation, Henry. So going back to the brain maps that you had showed us, we had some folks asking about whether conditions like ADHD, for example, hampered the brain from building and organizing the maps in sort of the way that you had shown, or if other conditions maybe did that sort of hampering effect also?
That is a great question. And Mike, why don't you tell us what your experience has been and the research you've done? So we know, as we talked about, that those brain maps get built through experience and learning. What happens to a kid if they have that kind of condition, whether it's a genetic condition, whether it's something else in their environment that's led to something like ADHD or even autism? Does that affect how those maps get built in the brain?
Course, and we know that it's primarily reflecting the fact that the machinery that's controlling your attentiveness, or they're controlling your ability to sustain your attention, your focus on task, and the machinery that's basically controlling the noisiness that's contributing to distractions, emerging thoughts, or things that carry you off the beam, so you lose your attention. Both sides of those are subject to improvement by brain training. So first of all, there are very compelling studies that demonstrate that when you use specific BrainHQ exercises in the attention category are really important for but all across the board, really. You actually improve attentiveness, and you improve the machinery that supports attentiveness. You improve the brightness, your alertness, your spark. They're increased as a consequence of you engaging the brain in these sort of exercise forms. Of course, there are other things you could do in your natural life that would contribute to the same thing. But in brain exercise and BrainHQ will also help you accomplish this. And then on the distraction side, any way that you reduce the noisiness of the operations of the brain is going to reduce the degree to which you're at the mercy of distractions. And we see this in many, many measures and studies that we've done in scientific outcomes. So that's the HD part of ADHD. So both of these were subject to improvement by training.
What else do we have, Stephanie? And we'll go a few minutes long. I know people are going to have to leave at the hour. Mike and I can stay on for a few more minutes because there's so many good questions coming in.
Yeah, ton of great questions. Thank you. So another question sort of following up to the presentation. Henry, you had mentioned specifically racket sports like ping pong or pickleball. Was there a reason specifically why racket sports? What about other forms of exercise like dancing or martial arts?
Oh, I think anything, again, that kind of hits on that notion of speed and accuracy is going to be good for brain help in that way. Martial arts is a great example. Actually, both my kids took karate lessons for many, many years. I think it was enormously helpful to their brain development. Dancing, there's actually been some nice studies showing that, learning how to dance. I think flamenco and ballroom, I've seen studies in particular, but I doubt it really matters. I think it's the learning and that notion of speed and accuracy. Really, I think what I'm trying to pull it apart from is, let's say you go to the gym and do the Stairmaster. That's great. That's going to be good for your heart health. There's definitely some effects on your brain health that come from having a healthier heart. But when we think about driving learning and we talk about making a faster and more accurate brain, I don't think the Stairmaster is going to do it. I think you need to be doing some of these other things as well. Martial arts and dancing are great examples. Mike, do you have anything else that jumps to your mind in terms of exercise or physical activity?
The key is speed and accuracy, but the key is also seriousness of intent.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever you do, you don't want it to be too casual. It has to matter to you.
It has to matter because it has to engage attention and reward in the ways we talked about. Again, if you're on the Stairmaster, I usually read a magazine, so I don't think I was paying attention to what I was doing. But if you are, let's say you're rock climbing, right? I mean, that's going to engage your attention and your reward in these really intense ways. That's probably going to be helpful to your brain.
The critical thing is that you're basically driving yourself in a progression in an improving direction. So it's not to I'm playing pickleball, let's take it easy now and forever. Your brain is not going very far. But if you're actually trying to advance, if you're actually working to slowly progress and try to go somewhere, so ultimately you can play with that person that's initially a lot better than you are and be effective. That's what matters. Yep. I mean, that's what's really valuable to you. It's to progress in your ability from your slow, pokey initiation to some faster and faster and faster and more capable and accurately responding form of pickleball.
Yep.
That's it. Take it seriously enough so that you're actually going somewhere to the advantage of your brain.
Yep. What do you think, Stephanie? We tackle one or two more questions here?
I think one brief one and then maybe one sort of to wrap up the
Okay,
whole
that sounds great.
situation here. A lot of people, when hearing about crossword puzzles as control games, were concerned and very worried that maybe, doing their Sudoku or playing chess or playing various card games is not maybe as good for their brain as doing like BrainHQ would be, as we had sort of said. Can you talk about that? Maybe put some minds at ease or maybe make
Sure.
some suggestions?
I wouldn't want anyone to think those are bad activities, right? There's
Yeah.
nothing bad that's going to happen to you as a result of doing crossword puzzles. Here's the example from my life. I do the Wordle, if you know that New York Times puzzle where you have to guess a 5-letter word. I do that just about every day. My wife does it too. It's fun to kind of compare notes on it. And that's great. I would never tell anyone if you like doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku, you should keep doing that. It's important to get some joy in this life. I would say that that's not the single thing that you can do that is best for your brain health. Again, don't get me wrong, it's not bad for your brain health, right? But if you are looking at that and you're thinking, well, I did the crossword puzzle today. I've done everything I need to do for my brain health. I can take it easy for the rest of the day. I would say that's not the best way to think about it. You need to get out there and do something that's going to make your brain faster and accurate. Do some BrainHQ, of course, that's going to help, and any of the other activities. So have fun, do a crossword puzzle. But when people come to me and they say, I'm doing crossword puzzles, is that helping maintain my brain health? Probably not as much as we would like. I don't know, Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I agree. And one of the reasons is that it's basically not progressively speeded. I do crossword puzzles. I've never failed to do
Fun.
a crossword puzzle over 50 years on this.
Oh my God. All right. Well, that's pretty incredible.
At least on Sunday. And I do other puzzles, but I know that it's not particularly neurologically useful.
Yep.
I think it is a form of calibration. I think that if you're still able to manipulate, words and letters and words and come up with answers, and in a sense, you're enriching your language usage by manipulating information and thought. That it's good. It's not negative.
Yeah.
There's some significant positive benefit, but again, we use it. It's been used over and over and over again by scientists who've done controlled trials looking at the benefits in your physical and functional brain. And it's used in part because we know people will believe it works, but it's not does not drive particularly strong changes.
So have fun with it, but also do some other things that are good for your brain health.
Right.
All right, Stephanie, do you have a wrap-up question for us to take us on out here?
I do. So we have a lot of people writing in saying, I'm in my 40s and I'm noticing this thing. I'm having trouble with word finding, or I'm in my 60s and I'm starting to have some memory issues. For these people and everybody else in the audience, when is the right time to start brain training? Like, should you be proactive about it, or should you sort of like take a more reactive approach when you start noticing these things? Maybe consider doing it.
Great question, Mike. When should people start doing
It
BrainHQ?
should be part of the regime of every individual, sort of from cradle to grave. but of course, you can think of the average individual as entering the epoch of decline roughly around their 30th birthday. And so you can, and that's when the average citizen in the United States begins to fall off the cliff. And in every 30 years, they move a standard deviation across the normal distribution. That's a big distance across the normal distribution in relation to other people that they work with, or other people that are in their community, or other people that might be living in their home. And that's a big difference. In 60 years, they're really declined in relation to the average person. And this decline is not just reflected in speed and accuracy. Ultimately, it's going to be reflected in your cognitive powers and your ability to be effective. But most of all, it's going to put you in danger. So basically, why not think of your life as an adult from your 20s, from your 30s, as a life of continuous personal growth? Why not think of your brain, because you have these powers, of being a brain that's going to continue to improve as long as you are on this mortal coil? Why not? Why not? Why not aspire to that? And why not think that you might basically in your 90s be pretty competitive with most people that are still in their 20s and 30s, because that's not impossible. So go for it. live a life in which you're paying attention to the brain, and use plasticity to your advantage.
That is a perfect note. And Mike, I think that's the perfect note to close on. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Stephanie, thank you for hosting us. Hey, I know we got a ton of questions and we answered several, but if we didn't answer yours, you can always follow us up by emailing us at support@brainhq.com. We're happy to take them. And Mike, this has been very fun to do with you, and we should do some more next year and try and take more of these kinds of questions as they come in. So thank you.
I'm sure that'll happen, Henry.
I look forward to it. And to everyone who's in the middle of the holiday season, happy holidays. To everyone who's looking forward to more holidays come, I look forward to that as well. And I hope you keep up with BrainHQ. Keep your brain sharp in the holidays. And then, hey, as we kick off the new year, we're going to have a lot of more fun ways to keep your brain healthy. So thanks to everyone for joining us in this busy season.
One more day of those Hanukkah candles and then turn on those Christmas candles. It's all.
We'll get them all. We'll get them all.
All right.
Thank you,
Thanks, folks.
folks.